listening to a Taxcast Extra from the Tax Justice Network with me, Naomi Fowler. For all our monthly Taxcasts, go to www.taxjustice.net/Taxcast. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher and all sorts of other podcast platforms. We're also available to all radio broadcasters, so if your favourite station's not playing us, ask them why not. In this Taxcast Extra, we're looking at the Institute for Public Policy Research's Commission on Economic Justice report called Time for Change, a new vision for the British economy. You can find that report on their website, www.ippr.org. The report argues that the British economic model needs fundamental reform, something the Tax Justice Network would certainly agree with. As is the case with many so-called developed economies around the world, the British economy is no longer delivering rising earnings for most of the population. Young people today are set to be poorer than their parents, and there's a huge North-South Divide, exacerbated by what the Tax Justice Network calls the finance curse, an oversized, damaging finance sector that's gained far too much power. According to this report, the British economy is suffering from deep and long-standing weaknesses, and it's totally unfit to face the challenges of the 2020s. I'm talking to Grace Blakeley of the Institute for Public Policy Research about the report. This is an interim report. Why interim and what's coming next? What are the next steps?
Yeah, great. Well, glad you asked. So the Commission on Economic Justice is a 2-year programme. And the interim report is our research to date over the first year of the CEJ. And so the programme has brought together a number of different commissioners from the private sector, from the third sector, policymakers, various different people, in order to analyse the structural issues underlying the British economy, and also to try and suggest some emerging innovative solutions. So the interim report is really our diagnosis, as it were. It's us looking at the problems the British economy currently faces, digging a little bit down into those, so looking at the structural issues that underlie them and how that's going to relate to some challenges that we're going to face over the next 5-10 years, to pave the way for the final report, which will be a kind of suite of policy solutions, which we hope will address each of the issues that we've identified in the interim report. That will be this time next year.
Okay, great. All right. So that'd be 2018, sort of towards the end of the year. Let's talk about the share of economic benefits, because that's what it really drills down to. Some of the claims made by the report are really quite shocking in terms of, if we look at the stagnation in wages, the longest period of earnings stagnation for 150 years. And it's, what this pointed out with the economy is no longer raising living standards for most of the population, a really serious situation where we're not in a position where children are getting on better than their parents.
Yeah. The findings on earnings were particularly stark. So as you said, this has been the longest period of wage stagnation since the 19th century. That's led to a number of other issues with regards to kind of household debt and things like that, which is almost approaching its pre-crisis peak. So getting on to kind of 2007 levels. And that relates to a number of other kind of structural changes in the UK's economy. So in the labour market, for example, you hear a lot at the moment about how unemployment is the lowest it's ever been. But what you don't hear about is the kind of the move towards the casualised labour market, towards the gig economy. We've had an explosion of 0 hours contracts, which have increased about 5-fold since before the crisis. There's a huge amount more self-employment, and people who are self-employed are now much more likely to be on low wages than they once were. There's quite high levels of underemployment, so people who would like to work more hours than they're able to. And this also relates to the UK's productivity crisis. So productivity in the UK is about 13% below the G7 averages. And that's in the context of a kind of broad general slowdown in productivity across the developed world. So the picture is even more stark. We've basically seen productivity stagnate since the financial crisis. And that's really quite worrying because productivity is tied to wages. So without high productivity, you don't get increases in wages. And it's also just how, economic growth really increases over the long run without, increase in productivity, so the increased efficiency of turning inputs into outputs, then you just don't get that kind of long run sustained economic growth that we've seen over the last kind of 50 years.
Right, and there's lots of things that government has been failing to do for a very long time to lead to this position where we're seeing the wage share, the actual share of national income going to wages declining over a long period of time, whilst the share going to profits has increased. Talk me through GDP per head, because that's quite interesting. It's risen by 12% since 2010, while average earnings per employee have fallen by 6%. Can you unpack that for me?
Yes. So this kind of relates to, it relates to what you were just talking about. So the share of growth going to capital versus labour, but also just the general issue of inequality. So we recently, again, you hear kind of inequalities like flattened out almost. But actually what we've seen is over the last 30 years, a dramatic increase in inequality in the UK. So between 1979 and 2012, only 10% of overall income growth went to the bottom half of the income distribution, with 40% going to the richest tenth. And that also reflects kind of corporate incomes, with the salaries of CEOs and executives up to 150 times. Those of ordinary workers up from about 20 times not so long ago. So we've just had this massive explosion in inequality, basically. And wealth inequality is actually even starker than income inequality. So our wealth Gini, which is the income Gini is a kind of measure of inequality, and the wealth Gini is a similar measure, is really very dramatically high. It's almost as high as the level you see in Russia. So we have had this explosion of inequality in both wealth and income terms over the last 30 years. And that relates to a number of underlying kind of broad structural trends in the UK economy, not least what the Tax Justice Network talks about quite a lot, which is the explosion of financial services and the financialisation of the UK's economy, which actually, as we look into the report, we find that whilst we have one of the world's largest financial sectors, that is not financing investment in the broader economy. We actually have one of the lowest levels of investment of any major economy. One of the kind of really interesting points that came out was that the UK government invests less in nominal terms than Volkswagen. So, we're really not doing enough. The public sector isn't doing enough investment. The private sector isn't doing enough investment, and it's not being supported by our huge financial services sector to do that. The financialisation of the economy is a trend that underlies that explosion in inequality over the last 30 years.
Right, and it's also what has driven this North-South divide that has become worse and worse. And this is an issue close to my heart as a Brummie. The UK being the most geographically unbalanced economy in Europe, which doesn't surprise me at all, but it's very interesting that the report pointed that out. With 40% of output produced in London and the South East, and such a very much lower average income that you're seeing in the Northwest, Southwest, West Midlands, where I'm from, and Wales, 30% lower than in London, which is incredible. Tell me a bit about that, and what has led to that huge and increasing divide, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the emergence of the North-South divide is a really interesting question, and it does relate to some of those other trends we were just talking about. So kind of the rise of finance, the decline of manufacturing in the UK. Yeah, as you said, there is this, 40% of our output is produced in London and the South East, which makes us the most regionally unequal country in Europe. And underlying that is this significant disparity in productivity. And so in London is the only region of the UK where labour productivity is above national averages. Everywhere else, it's below. And again, this relates to the significant disparities you see in earnings. And you really, so this gap steadily opens up across the since the Second World War, really. And after the period of the Second World War, we kind of start to see policy decisions made in Westminster which start to privilege finance in London and the South East against the interests of manufacturing. So to kind of paint a very broad brush picture, throughout the kind of the 60s and 70s, you have exchange rate policies relating to kind of Bretton Woods institutions. And before that, you had the gold standard, of course, which also fed into this, which meant that the UK had a significantly overvalued currency, which, up until very recently, it kind of still has and arguably still does. And that privilege the interests of finance. You wanted a kind of stable, valuable currency to allow them to kind of to trade internationally. And it significantly disadvantaged manufacturing, which obviously, in order to export, requires a competitive currency. So you saw that throughout the 60s and 70s. The real explosion in inequality, though, happens during the 80s, when you see this, the monetarist neoliberal policies of Thatcher coming in, and you get the massive deregulation of finance, a kind of explosion in the financial sector, and obviously the kind of the labour disputes that were occurring over that time, with essentially Thatcher and business winning, in inverted commas, against the interests of labour and manufacturing. So at that point, you start to see a really sharp decline in the share of GDP coming as a result of manufacturing, and a significant increase in services, particularly in financial services and professional services. And this matters for the regional issue, because financial services are uniquely concentrated in London. London has this really distinct comparative advantage as the centre of global finance. And the UK's regions were always much more their economies were much more focused on primary and secondary industry, so mining, manufacturing, all these sorts of issues. And so this North-South Divide was really set in stone after the 80s, after kind of Thatcher had won, really. And since then, we haven't really done enough to tackle it. There's been, to an extent, New Labour kind of replaced manufacturing employment with public sector employment. So public sector employment was very high in places like the Northeast throughout the late 90s and early noughties. And with austerity, even that kind of last source of employment has started to reduce. So all these structural issues relate kind of underlie the emergence of this North-South divide. But what we really think has allowed it to kind of continue unabated has been the fact that all significant policy decisions about the economy are made in Westminster. So it's not a coincidence that the UK is not just the most economically unbalanced country in Europe. It's also the most politically centralised. So everywhere else in Germany and various other countries across Europe, you have much stronger local and regional governments who are able to take strategic decisions about the direction of their local and regional economies. And you just don't have that in the UK. So as London, as Westminster was kind of taking all these decisions that advantaged finance in London and the South East, there was no real counterweight in terms of devolved administrations to kind of push back against that, which has just created a positive cycle of increasing economic and political power going to London, and reduced economic and political power in the UK's regions. And this is going to be the subject of another full report that we'll have coming out fairly soon, where we'll look into these issues in more detail.
Yeah, it does raise some really interesting questions about decentralising control over economies in different regions. And, I'm just thinking of there was a referendum on whether or not Birmingham people wanted a mayor. They said they didn't, and their decision was ignored, and there was a mayoral contest anyway. I think it's not something that local people are necessarily seeing that would benefit their regions yet.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a really important issue. So we have had, as you mentioned, there have been some mayoral contests recently. There was one in the West Midlands. There was one in Greater Manchester. And to an extent, the fact that turnout was fairly low in some of those elections does kind of vindicate your point, right? That people aren't particularly bothered about having these regional centres of governance. But what you kind of do see is that in terms of the international experience, as devolved institutions get more power and start to actually play a much greater role in people's day-to-day lives, they start to gain more support and people start to become more interested in them. Because, of course, when your regional government doesn't really have any control over what's going on in your area or your region, then you have less of an incentive to go out and vote. So kind of empowering those institutions will be a really important next step. The kind of argument before that is that actually having stronger subnational institutions is a really significant variable in protecting regional economies against economic shocks. So there's some literature, some academic studies that show that areas with strong subnational governance, their regional economies are better protected against external shocks and against kind of structural changes in the global economy. So we kind of argue that if we had those institutions, it wouldn't completely mitigate all the kind of structural trends that I was talking about, but it would allow areas to kind of adapt and respond more dynamically and more quickly.
Right, yeah, that's obviously a way to go to convincing local people of that. When it comes to the north as well, there's been so much talk about the northern powerhouse from so many governments, and yet it's not something, how much investment has actually gone up to the north for, developing economies in those regions?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that, actually, because IPPR, so I wrote a report a while ago looking at the investment gap for infrastructure more broadly between the north and the south. And we found that there was a £1,500 per capita gap in public investment in transport between London and the north. So London has got £1,500 more of public investment in transport than most people across the north. And that's looking at the north as the whole, right? In Yorkshire, the gap is much larger. They get the lowest level of investment per capita in the whole country. So you're quite right to say that actually this investment hasn't been forthcoming. What was interesting recently is that when we published this, we started a petition to say, actually, this isn't fair. We're talking about the Northern Powerhouse. That needs to be backed up by real investment in tangible infrastructure. And Chris Grayling, the Transport Secretary, came back to us and actually disputed our figures and said, no, this isn't right. You're not taking into account kind of local issues and whatever. We actually then came back to him and were able to kind of fact check that and say, no, actually, there is this huge gap. And it's not just so our analysis is based on the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which looks at planned spending. And we show that planned spending is actually disproportionately focused on the southeast, but so has past spending. And that was one of the points that we made in response to him. So this is it's a very political issue, especially at the moment when the government has been making such a big fuss out of the Northern Powerhouse agenda. But we are consistently saying and pointing out, using our kind of statistical analysis, that actually this is not being followed. This rhetoric is not being followed by the kind of investment that would be required to rebalance the economy away from London and the southeast.
Right, and just an anecdotal comment to throw in. There are many reasons why, but, for example, when I go to Birmingham, I pay £2.40 per bus journey. It's almost double what Londoners pay, and yet people are on much lower wages. There's many reasons that we could go into. Congestion charge doesn't exist outside London, unfortunately, hasn't been implemented elsewhere. But when it comes to investment, lots of people mean different things by investment, right? What do you mean by investment that should happen as opposed to investment that hasn't happened or is supposedly happening but it's not being effective?
That's actually a really good question, and it's a question that we will be going into when we do these reports. When we measure investment, we look at things like gross fixed capital formation and kind of fairly abstract measures of capital that are being invested in the economy. But actually, we kind of think that there could and should be a broader measure of what investment looks like. So when you talk about investment, it's generally infrastructure investment, so building roads, kind of bridges, energy facilities, these sorts of things. And that's because the money that you put into them ultimately kind of there's a multiplier and it creates more value both in the short and the longer term. But we also think that, it's not just infrastructure that works like that. It's also things like education, like healthcare. If you invest in your education system, that is an investment in human capital that ultimately leads to a better educated workforce and potentially greater GDP growth over the longer term. So actually interrogating this question about what is investment, how do we measure it, and how does that relate to how we could look at investment, what investment could be, and perhaps thinking about introducing a broader conception of what investment is into public discourse, so that we start really valuing things like spending on healthcare and education, not just as current spending, but as actually something as an investment in our future.
The report says Britain stands at a watershed moment, and it's really time for new thinking. And, there are fundamental reforms the report highlights of the British economy. And it does say on a scale comparable with the Atlee reforms of the 1940s and the Thatcher revolution of the 1980s. So I was just wondering if we could look at tax first of all, because one of the areas that you talk about in the report is taxation and how that should be reformed. So tell me about that.
So, we look at the kind of changes in tax policy that have happened kind of over the course of the last 30-ish years. And we look at the change in the structure of revenues that have been gained from taxation. And we find that there's a growing kind of fiscal gap. The demands on the public sector are increasing, but tax receipts have stayed stable at around kind of the mid-30s percentage of GDP. Actually, the revenues gained from taxation in the UK are considerably lower than in most other European economies. And we look into the reasons for that, and it's actually not just kind of top level tax rates, right? There's, as you know, the UK tax system is incredibly complicated. And not particularly intuitive. So some of the reason for that fiscal gap is due to kind of loopholes, is due to the way in which it's, as you guys highlight so well, it's very much easier perhaps in the UK than it is in other places to avoid and evade those taxes. It's to do with the kind of the complicated nature of, say, business taxes, which are divided between corporation tax and business rates and national insurance, or income tax, which is not just the income tax, it's also national insurance paid on earnings, and things like capital gains tax and all these different taxes, which are more of a legacy of the kind of institutional structures and changes that have happened in UK government than they are respond to any kind of, economic common sense. So we're really looking at ways in which we can kind of start simplifying the UK's tax system at once as making it more progressive and harder to avoid and evade. Right.
And yet there's always this argument that it goes on and on and on that if you keep taxes low, then that can only be good to help grow an economy.
This is actually quite interesting, because that argument, we could have that argument on the one hand. On the other hand, there are very easy ways to reform the tax system, make it more progressive, less harsh on kind of ordinary working people, without raising taxes for the majority in a way that's fiscally neutral. So say if we look at actual real rates of kind of income tax payments, when you look at income tax and national insurance is actually very regressive in the way it's charged. You get a huge amount of the burden of UK income taxation, when you look at national insurance and income tax, falls on the kind of the middle part of the spectrum. So we don't really tax the wealthy very much, and the kind of poorer and middling earners end up paying a fairly high proportion. Even though allegedly, if you look to the income tax bands, you'd see that they go up, 20, 30, 40%. And it looks like, therefore, that we have a progressive system. When you combine that with national insurance and various other things, you start seeing that it's not very progressive. So one of the things we're looking into is whether or not we should have a combined national insurance and income tax, which operates as a formula-based system. So rather than having three bands of, say, 20%, 30%, 40% that then interact with national insurance in a fairly complicated way, we could have whatever your income was, it would then be plugged into a formula, which was a progressive sliding scale that would then give you your tax burden, and that would get rid of some of these really kind of complex and quite regressive features of the UK tax system in a way that was fiscally neutral, in a way that was more progressive, and that actually kind of cut around this debate of, okay, is levying more tax on people, anti-entrepreneurial and anti-business, and actually just saying, well, even outside of that, the UK tax system just isn't working.
Right. Especially if you look at the working poor, which seems to be becoming a larger and larger percentage of the population.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at so the experience of poverty in the UK has changed fundamentally over the last kind of 30-ish years. Now, at least 60% of households in poverty have one person in work. So this phenomenon of in-work poverty is really becoming much more widespread. And it kind of undermines this argument that actually, people who are on the receipt of state benefits are lazy and you just need to be incentivized in order to get a job. Actually, what we're seeing is people working incredibly hard to try and survive in the context of low wages, high costs of living, and really not having the kind of support that they need in order to do that. So we need to think about, a way in which we can make our taxation and welfare system sustainable enough to support a wider range of people who will be relying on it at different points in their lives as work becomes more casualised and potentially as wages stagnate.
Right, and that brings me on to one of the other recommendations that the report does propose urgent reform in terms of the power of trade unions. What's meant by that?
Yeah, so I should say that all the things that I mentioned here, the kind of policy solutions we're looking at, we're not set on anything yet. So this interim report was basically saying, here are the problems. We're going to spend the next year looking at the solutions. And so with regards to unions, we're looking at a number of different things. We're looking at, should we have kind of mandatory or opt-out unionisation? So everyone kind of is default enrolled in a union and they can choose to opt out if they want to. We're looking at how you unionise workers in the gig economy. And trying to kind of modernise the union movement. So kind of looking into things like, just as Deliveroo works based on an app, could you have a Deliveroo union that works based on an app in a similar sort of way? So we really think that, aside from all the various structural issues around productivity and everything that I've mentioned up to now, the lack of unionisation is really accelerating these issues around low pay, because it's completely contrary to all economic wisdom that you would have such high rates of employment as we do now, and yet continued wage stagnation. And we think a large part of the reason for that is that employees don't feel empowered enough to be able to go to their employers and say, we want a pay rise, at least partly because of a lack of unionisation.
And there's also other ideas around number of representation of workers on company boards, things like this. I guess you'd be looking at that too.
Yeah, we've actually just had a report out fairly recently on the corporate governance system in the UK. So looking at how we can kind of incentivise this move away from short-term shareholder capitalism, in which companies are kind of governed based on this concept of shareholder value, towards a broader, longer-term conception of stakeholder value. So engaging all the different stakeholders in companies, ensuring that workers do have a voice in the important decisions that are made with regards to the governance of businesses, in order to incentivize this move away from just businesses looking at the short term, extracting more and more value out of a company, perhaps not investing as much as they might if they were looking at the longer term future of their business.
I wanted to ask you about one of the issues which is highlighted by the report in terms of market dominance of digital companies like Amazon, Facebook and Google, and why that is such a problem. I mean, obviously we've seen this very worrying shift towards monopolistic practices, and that has a lot of repercussions for all of us, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, there are kind of economic and political issues about the rise of the big tech monopolies. In a way, they would argue that their business model means that they can only ever operate as monopolies because they essentially produce their outputs at zero marginal cost, which just means that, once you have Facebook, it doesn't really take any input to produce another Facebook profile. It doesn't take any more input to play a Spotify song, more than once or, once it's been created. So this problem of zero marginal cost means that if you don't have one big company controlling the whole of the network and getting all the benefits that arise from those network effects, then it becomes almost impossible to provide those services free of charge as we experience them now. Of course, the big issue is that we aren't providing them free of charge, because the reason these network effects exist is because these companies gain so much economic value and actually power, economic and political power, from access to our data. And this is the big issue, is that we are essentially selling Facebook, Google, whoever, our data in exchange for access to a free service that they control as a monopoly. So this is a huge challenge. It's an economic challenge in the sense that, having huge monopolies is not good for the economy. But it's also a political challenge because these things are so impossible to regulate. They are so huge. They span multiple different jurisdictions. They span, many different actual corporate entities in many different ways. Like Uber is two different corporate entities. Google has many different corporate entities. So they are very, very difficult to regulate. And as I said, we will be looking into various different solutions as to how we can try and control and, gain the kind of the value that we've been used to getting out of these big companies, whilst also ensuring that they don't have too much power over our data, our economies and our political systems.
There's a lot of debate going on at the moment. This idea about free markets. We've just seen a Prime Minister giving a speech about how nobody must tell her that free markets haven't been wonderful and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. And it's as though any criticism of these so-called free markets, which of course are not free markets in some senses, you become categorized as some kind of radical revolutionary. It's not really possible yet to have a sensible debate, although I think that we're getting there, about this idea about free markets and, regulated markets in the public interest.
Yeah, completely. I think what's really interesting about the fact that we've heard this recent speech from Theresa May is the fact that she feels, her and Philip Hammond both feel the need to go back and defend free markets. Now, over the past, since the 80s, really, there hasn't really been the need to do that because it's just been political common sense that free markets are good, government regulation, all those sorts of things are bad, and that, the state steps in at the last minute if and when the market fails. So the fact that Theresa May is now coming up and actually saying, wait, guys, remember, free markets are a good thing is interesting because it, presumes that actually they are losing that debate now. And that's hardly surprising given all the things that we've just been talking about the lived experience of the economy. And that does actually show up in the proportion of people who think that capitalism needs fundamental reform, which is extremely high at the moment and higher than it's been in a long time. And of course, the thing we always come back to is, as you said, there are no such thing as free markets, right? We structure our markets in particular ways based on, our histories, our politics, our societies, various different things. And the structures that we use to determine the economic models that we have also determine the kind of society that we live in. So the choices that we've made over the last, 30-ish years to, as I said, kind of, have this huge disembedded financial sector, to kind of allow this massive regional divide to open up, to have low wages, to not have particularly high unionization. All these different things are a result of the kind of the market structures that we've created, of the incentives that are embedded in our economic model. And we do have a choice as to what those structures are and as to the values that they represent. And the whole point of the Commission on Economic Justice is to say, actually, these are the choices that we've made up until now. This has been the results. We are at a moment of really quite substantial change, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And that moment of change gives us the opportunity to stand back and say, are these the right choices? Is this the kind of society and economy that we do want to build for ourselves? Do we feel like we live in an economy that promotes justice and other things that we as a society do value? And if we say no, which is, I imagine, the answer that a lot of people would give, then you start to get to the point of, okay, so what should our markets look like if we accept that there are no just pre-existing abstract notions of free markets that are not determined by society at large? Then what kind of structures should we be putting in place? What kind of norms should we be trying to embed in our economic system? And that is really the task that we are setting ourselves over the course of the next year.
OK, and that report will be out towards the end of 2018. We'll be looking forward to that one. I've been talking to Grace Blakeley of the Institute for Public Policy Research. Again, you can read the Institute for Public Policy Research's Commission on Economic Justice report, Time for Change, a New Vision for the British Economy, on www.ippr.org. You've been listening to a Taxcast Extra from the Tax Justice Network. Thanks for listening.